Many beloved Hollywood actors from the golden age of cinema had surprising backgrounds as trained soldiers before they became famous. These weren't just actors playing tough guys on screen. They were men who had actually experienced combat, faced death, and in some cases, taken lives in real warfare. Their authentic experiences shaped their performances in ways that made them uniquely convincing in their roles. 1. Audie Murphy. Audie Murphy stands out as perhaps the most remarkable example of a soldier-turned-actor. Despite his small stature and boyish appearance, Murphy became the most decorated American soldier in World War II before launching a successful film career. Murphy's military achievements were extraordinary. He received an impressive 24 military decorations, including the Medal of Honor, the Distinguished Service Cross, 3 Purple Hearts, and 2 Silver Stars. His most legendary action came when he single-handedly held off an entire German company for an hour by climbing atop a burning tank destroyer and using its machine gun to kill or wound approximately 50 enemy soldiers, all while wounded himself. In total, Murphy confirmed killing 33 German soldiers in individual combat, with dozens more probable kills in group fighting. After the war, his photograph appeared on the cover of Life magazine, which caught the attention of actor James Cagney, and led to Murphy's invitation to Hollywood. Unlike many veterans who downplayed their military experiences, Murphy's early film career was built specifically on his war record. His autobiography, To Hell and Back, was later adapted into a film starring Murphy himself. However, even as studios capitalized on his hero status, they simplified his experiences and omitted the psychological toll of combat. What the public didn't know was how deeply Murphy struggled with what we now recognize as PTSD. He slept with a loaded pistol under his pillow, suffered from insomnia and nightmares, and developed a gambling addiction. His second wife reported that he once held her at gunpoint during a flashback episode. Film historians have noted that Murphy's performances contained an authenticity that other actors couldn't duplicate, a 1,000-yard stare that felt genuine because it was. He wasn't just portraying trauma, he was processing his own experiences on screen. 2. Charles Bronson. Charles Bronson's steely gaze and unflinching demeanor in films like Death Wish and Once Upon a Time in the West weren't just acting choices. They were informed by his experiences as an aerial gunner who faced death on 25 bombing missions over Nazi-occupied Europe. Born Charles Bukinski to Lithuanian immigrant parents, Bronson grew up in Pennsylvania's coal mining region before being drafted into the Army Air Forces in 1943. As a B-29 tail gunner in the 760th Flexible Gunnery Training Squadron, Bronson's military role was explicitly lethal, protecting his aircraft by firing 50-caliber machine guns at enemy fighters attempting to shoot down his bomber. What made Bronson's service particularly dangerous was the notorious risk faced by bomber crews. The life expectancy of a B-29 crewman on combat deployment was measured in weeks, not years. Isolated in the tail section of the aircraft, Bronson experienced each mission from one of the most vulnerable and psychologically intense positions, watching enemy fighters approach while knowing he was their primary target. Unlike some veterans who rarely discuss their service, Bronson occasionally acknowledged how his combat experience informed his acting. "I suppose I look like a tough customer," he once told an interviewer, "but it's not something I put on for the camera. When you've seen real violence up close, it stays with you." Bronson's military experience contributed to his distinctive screen presence. The minimalist dialogue, the unflinching gaze, and the comfort with silence that became his trademarks. These qualities made him particularly effective in westerns and action films, where his authentic aura of danger set him apart from actors who merely played at toughness. Director Sergio Leone, who cast Bronson in Once Upon a Time in the West, later explained his choice. Charles has a face that looks like it has experienced everything. You cannot fake that quality. It comes from actually having seen life and death up close. 3. Lee Marvin. Lee Marvin's chilling portrayals of violent men in films like The Killers and Point Blank drew on first-hand experience most actors lack. His service as a Marine Corps scout sniper during some of the Pacific War's most brutal campaigns gave him an authentic understanding of combat that informed his performances. Marvin enlisted in the Marines in 1942 and was assigned to the 4th Marine Division. Trained as a scout sniper, he participated in the invasion of Saipan in 1944, where he experienced close-quarters combat that few Hollywood actors could imagine. During the battle, Marvin was seriously wounded by machine gun fire that severed his sciatic nerve, earning him a Purple Heart and medical discharge. What distinguished Marvin's military service was both its lethal nature and how directly he incorporated those experiences into his acting approach. Unlike some veterans who maintained strict separation between their war experiences and their performing careers, Marvin explicitly drew on his combat background to inform his characterizations. Director John Boorman, who worked with Marvin on Point Blank, later recalled, "Lee told me he wasn't acting in the violent scenes. He was remembering. He had a 1,000-yard stare that came from actually having seen men die and having almost died himself." Marvin was unusually forthcoming about the psychological impact of combat. In a 1969 interview, he stated, "Once you faced a machine gun firing at you, followed by a bayonet wound knowing you're going to die, everything else is small stuff." This perspective perhaps explains the unique quality Marvin brought to his performances. A man who had seen authentic violence and could distinguish between Hollywood's stylized version and the messy, chaotic reality. What makes Marvin's case particularly interesting is how his combat experience informed not just his approach to violent roles, but his entire philosophy of acting. He became known for an almost documentary-like naturalism that rejected theatrical artifice in favor of psychological truth. This approach reached its apex in his Oscar-winning dual role in Cat Ballou, where even his comedic performance carried an undercurrent of authentic toughness. 4. James Stewart. James Stewart's screen persona, the thoughtful, soft-spoken everyman with steel beneath the gentle exterior, aligned remarkably well with his military career as a bomber pilot who rose from private to colonel during active service, and eventually to brigadier general in the Air Force Reserve. Unlike many actors who entered service as enlisted men or in special entertainment units, Stewart was already a major star when he became one of the first Hollywood figures to enlist after Pearl Harbor. Despite his celebrity status and being slightly over the age limit, Stewart insisted on combat duty rather than ceremonial or entertainment roles. What makes Stewart's military service particularly notable was its increasingly lethal nature. After initially being relegated to making training films and flying stateside missions, Stewart campaigned repeatedly for combat assignments. He eventually flew 20 official combat missions as command pilot over Nazi Germany with the 445th Bombardment Group, though biographers suggest his actual mission count was closer to 25. The nature of strategic bombing in World War II makes Stewart's role explicitly that of a trained killer, though one operating at the remove of an aircraft rather than in direct ground combat. The B-24 Liberator bombers Stewart commanded carried up to 8,000 pounds of ordnance designed specifically to destroy enemy infrastructure, factories, and personnel. Each mission he led potentially resulted in hundreds of deaths on the ground. Stewart received multiple decorations for his service, including the Distinguished Flying Cross with Oak Leaf Cluster, the Air Medal with 3 Oak Leaf Clusters, and the French Croix de Guerre. After the war, he remained in the Air Force Reserve eventually reaching the rank of brigadier general in 1959, the highest military rank achieved by any actor in Hollywood history. What's particularly interesting about Stewart's case is how thoroughly his combat experiences were downplayed in his post-war image. While studios proudly acknowledged his service, the psychological impact and lethal nature of his missions were rarely discussed. Stewart himself maintained near-complete silence about the details of his combat experience for decades, only occasionally alluding to them in private conversations. Director Anthony Mann, who directed Stewart in several films, including the psychological western Winchester 73, once observed, "There's something in Jimmy since the war, a darkness and intensity that wasn't there in his pre-war work. He can access something now that gives his performances a depth they didn't have before." 5. Neville Brand. Neville Brand's chilling portrayals of gangsters and villains drew on a military background so distinguished that he ranked as the fourth most decorated American soldier of World War II before menacing audiences in films like Stalag 17 and DOA. Brand enlisted in the Army in March 1941 before Pearl Harbor brought America officially into the war. Assigned to the 331st Infantry Regiment of the 83rd Infantry Division, he participated in intense combat operations after D-Day, including the Battle of the Bulge. During his service, Brand was wounded in action and awarded numerous decorations, including the Silver Star, Purple Heart, and the World War II Victory Medal. What makes Brand's military service particularly notable was both its duration and intensity. Unlike some actors who served relatively brief tours or in support roles, Brand experienced sustained frontline combat against German forces across France and into Germany itself. As an infantry sergeant, his military role explicitly involved direct engagement with enemy forces, sometimes in hand-to-hand combat. Brand rarely discussed the specifics of his combat experiences, but occasionally acknowledged their lasting impact. "After you face death," he once told an interviewer, "pretending to be scared in front of a camera doesn't seem like much of a challenge." This perspective perhaps explains the authentic intensity Brand brought to his villainous roles, a quality of genuine danger that set him apart from actors merely playing at being threatening. What's particularly interesting about Brand's case is how his combat experience informed his portrayal of both villains and military characters. While he frequently played criminals and heavies due to his intimidating appearance, he brought unusual depth to these roles. His portrayal of Al Capone in the television series The Untouchables remains definitive, partly because Brand understood something about violence and its consequences that purely theatrical actors couldn't access. Despite his extensive combat experience, Brand struggled with the psychological aftermath of war, developing alcoholism that affected both his personal life and career. This struggle perhaps explains the particular authenticity he brought to roles depicting men on society's margins, individuals fighting internal battles while presenting a hardened exterior to the world. 6. Sterling Hayden. Sterling Hayden's complex performances in film noir classics like The Asphalt Jungle and The Killing drew on one of Hollywood's most unusual military backgrounds, his service as an undercover OSS operative who ran covert operations behind enemy lines in World War II. Already a successful model and budding actor when war broke out, Hayden abandoned his film career to enlist in the Marines. His unusual combination of sailing experience and physical presence soon brought him to the attention of the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the precursor to the CIA, which recruited him for special operations. What makes Hayden's military service particularly remarkable was its clandestine and explicitly lethal nature. Under the code name John Hamilton, Hayden parachuted into Nazi-occupied Yugoslavia, where he ran operations supplying weapons to partisan fighters. Later, he operated with Italian resistance groups, helping to organize attacks on German forces. These weren't conventional military operations, but covert missions where discovery meant certain execution as a spy rather than treatment as a prisoner of war. For his extraordinary service, Hayden was awarded the Silver Star and a commendation from Marshal Tito of Yugoslavia. Yet, despite these decorations, Hayden's wartime activities remained classified for years, creating one of Hollywood's most dramatic disconnects between public image and private reality. What's particularly fascinating about Hayden's case is how his OSS experience may have contributed to his distinctive screen presence. The combination of physical toughness and psychological complexity that made him ideal for film noir. Unlike actors who projected simple heroism or villainy, Hayden specialized in morally ambiguous characters operating in gray areas between law and criminality, not unlike an undercover operative navigating enemy territory. Director John Huston, who cast Hayden in The Asphalt Jungle, later explained his choice. Sterling had a quality of having seen the worst of humanity, but not being corrupted by that knowledge. He understood moral compromise from the inside, which made him perfect for noir. Hayden's post-war life took complex turns that reflected his wartime experiences. His brief membership in the Communist Party, joined out of admiration for the Yugoslav partisans he had supported during the war, led to his controversial testimony before the House Un-American Activities Committee. This political complexity added another layer to his already unusual Hollywood career. 7. Robert Ryan. Robert Ryan's unforgettable portrayals of troubled, often violent men in classics like The Setup and Bad Day at Black Rock drew on his experiences as a Marine Corps drill instructor, a role that, while not involving direct combat, required him to train hundreds of men in the lethal skills necessary for warfare. Ryan joined the Marine Corps shortly after Pearl Harbor and was assigned as a drill instructor at Camp Pendleton. While he didn't see overseas combat, his military role was explicitly focused on preparing others to kill and survive in the Pacific Theater's brutal island campaigns. As a drill instructor, Ryan was responsible for transforming civilians into combat-ready Marines during an intensive training regime that emphasized both physical toughness and psychological preparation for the realities of warfare. What makes Ryan's military service particularly interesting is how it may have informed his unusual empathy for the damaged characters he often portrayed. Unlike actors who experienced the adrenaline and chaos of direct combat, Ryan observed the psychological transformation of young men being prepared for violence, a perspective that perhaps gave him unique insight into how ordinary individuals can be shaped into instruments of warfare. Director Nicholas Ray, who worked with Ryan on Flying Leathernecks and On Dangerous Ground, once observed, "Bob understands something profound about masculine violence, not just its expression, but its sources. There's a thoughtfulness to his brutality on screen that makes it more disturbing than simple aggression." What's particularly notable about Ryan's case is how his military experience aligned with his personal politics. Despite frequently playing bigots, violent criminals, and warmongers, Ryan himself was known for his progressive political views and anti-war stance. This apparent contradiction suggests how his military training may have given him insight into the psychology of violence without glorifying it, a complexity that enriched his performances. Unlike some actors whose military experience led to typecasting in heroic roles, Ryan's career took the opposite direction. His most memorable performances often involved deeply flawed, violent men whose psychology he explored with unusual depth. This willingness to examine the darker aspects of masculinity and violence set him apart from contemporaries who maintained more conventionally heroic screen personas. 8. Telly Savalas. Telly Savalas's commanding presence and unflinching portrayal of tough characters in films like The Dirty Dozen and the television series Kojak drew on his experiences in the Army during World War II, where he served in the Pacific Theater and was wounded in action. Savalas enlisted in the Army in 1943 and was assigned to Company C of the 12th Medical Training Battalion. Despite his medical unit designation, Savalas experienced direct combat during the brutal island-hopping campaigns against Japanese forces. While details of his specific combat actions remain limited, military records confirm he was wounded in action and received the Purple Heart, decorations not awarded for merely serving in a combat zone, but for actually experiencing enemy fire. What makes Savalas's military service particularly significant is how thoroughly it was downplayed in his public image. Unlike some veterans whose service became central to their Hollywood narratives, Savalas rarely discussed his combat experiences in detail. This reticence was typical of many Pacific Theater veterans, whose combat against Japanese forces often involved psychological and physical challenges different from those faced in the European theater. Director Robert Aldrich, who cast Savalas in The Dirty Dozen, later explained his choice. Telly didn't need to fake toughness or authority. When he gave an order on screen, you believed it because he had actually lived in circumstances where orders meant the difference between life and death. What's particularly interesting about Savalas's case is how his military experience may have informed his distinctive acting style. The economy of movement, the focused intensity, and the comfort with silence that became his trademarks. These qualities made him particularly effective in roles requiring the projection of authority and controlled aggression. Unlike some actors who struggled to reconcile their combat experiences with their post-war identities, Savalas developed a remarkably integrated public persona. His trademark bald head, adopted for a film role and maintained thereafter, lollipop prop, and catchphrase, "Who loves ya, baby?" created a character that combined toughness with surprising warmth, perhaps reflecting his own resolution of the psychological complexities of his wartime service. 9. Kirk Douglas. Kirk Douglas's intensity and physical presence in films like Champion and Paths of Glory were informed by his service in the United States Navy during World War II, where he served as a communications officer aboard the submarine chaser USS PC-1139 in the Pacific Theater. Douglas enlisted in the Navy in 1941, shortly before Pearl Harbor. While his role as a communications officer wasn't primarily combat-focused, service aboard a submarine chaser placed him directly in the dangerous environment of anti-submarine warfare. These vessels were tasked with hunting Japanese submarines using sonar and depth charges, missions that could quickly turn lethal if enemy submarines detected and targeted them first. What makes Douglas's military service particularly interesting is how it aligned with his pre-war background as a competitive wrestler and his developing interest in acting. This unique combination, athletic training, military discipline, and theatrical ambition, perhaps explains the distinctive intensity Douglas brought to his performances. Unlike actors who projected simple toughness, Douglas specialized in characters whose physical strength was matched by psychological complexity. Director Billy Wilder, who worked with Douglas on Ace in the Hole, later observed, "Kirk has something most actors have to fake: the knowledge of what it means to put your body on the line. Whether from his wrestling, his Navy service, or both, he understood physical risk in a way you can't learn in acting school." What's particularly notable about Douglas's case is how his military experience may have informed his approach to leadership, both on and off screen. As one of the first major stars to form his own production company, Douglas displayed organizational skills and strategic thinking that colleagues sometimes attributed to his naval officer training. This business acumen allowed him greater control over his career and the types of challenging roles he pursued. Unlike some veterans whose military service dominated their public image, Douglas integrated his naval experience into a broader narrative about his rise from poverty to success. In his autobiography, The Rag Man's Son, he presented his time in the Navy as one chapter in a larger American success story, an approach that resonated with post-war audiences navigating their own transitions to civilian life. 10. Clint Eastwood, the swim instructor who survived a military plane crash. Clint Eastwood's iconic tough guy persona, in films ranging from the Dirty Harry series to his acclaimed westerns, drew on a military background that, while not involving direct combat, included a life-threatening experience few could imagine: surviving a Navy plane crash into the Pacific Ocean during the Korean War era. Eastwood was drafted into the Army in 1951 during the Korean War and assigned as a swimming instructor at Fort Ord in California. While he didn't see combat in Korea, Eastwood experienced a harrowing brush with death when a Navy 81 Sky Raider he was aboard as a passenger crashed into the Pacific Ocean near Point Reyes, California. Eastwood and the pilot were forced to swim several miles through frigid waters to reach shore, a test of endurance and survival instinct that could easily have ended differently. What makes Eastwood's military experience particularly interesting is how this singular life-threatening incident may have informed his approach to portraying men in extreme circumstances. Unlike actors with extensive combat experience, Eastwood's brush with mortality came not through enemy action, but through an unexpected disaster that required immediate action for survival. A scenario that parallels many of his most famous character moments on screen. Director Don Siegel, who directed Eastwood in Dirty Harry and several other films, once observed, "Clint has a natural understanding of how men react in life-threatening situations, the economy of movement, the focus on essentials, the suppression of panic. That knowledge gives his performances an authenticity you can't fake." What's particularly notable about Eastwood's case is how his limited but intense military experience aligned with his minimalist acting style. The same efficient, no-wasted motion approach that might serve someone swimming for survival in cold ocean waters characterizes Eastwood's performances, a man who conveys maximum impact with minimum expression. While Eastwood's military service lacked the extended combat experiences of others on this list, his survival of a potentially fatal plane crash placed him in the small category of individuals who have directly faced their mortality and emerged with both physical and psychological lessons that couldn't be learned any other way. As Eastwood himself once remarked with characteristic brevity, "When you've had to swim for your life, you gain a certain perspective on what constitutes a real problem versus a manufactured one. That's useful in this business." These 10 legendary performers revealed the profound disconnect between Hollywood's carefully constructed combat narratives and the complex, sometimes traumatic realities experienced by actors who had actually served in wartime. From Audie Murphy's extraordinary battlefield heroism to Lee Marvin's experiences as a Marine Corps sniper, from James Stewart's bombing missions over Nazi Germany to Sterling Hayden's covert operations behind enemy lines, these military backgrounds created both psychological burdens and authentic insights that shaped some of cinema's most memorable performances. What emerges most clearly from these stories is how the Hollywood system simultaneously celebrated military service in the abstract, while often sanitizing its psychological complexities. Studios proudly touted their stars' veteran status in generic terms, while carefully avoiding detailed discussion of kill counts, close-quarters combat, or the lasting trauma that many brought back from the battlefield. This selective approach to military experience reflected broader American culture's difficulty in fully acknowledging the psychological cost of the very combat heroism it celebrated. Perhaps most revealing is how many of these actors' military backgrounds informed their most distinctive on-screen qualities. Murphy's haunted gaze, Marvin's controlled intensity, Bronson's stoic presence, Ryan's complex villain. These weren't simply acting techniques, but expressions of authentic experience that audiences intuitively recognized as truthful, even when they didn't know the biographical sources behind them. The legacy of these combat-experienced actors offers important insights into both Hollywood history and America's evolving relationship with its warriors. In an industry built on illusion, these performers brought something genuinely authentic to their craft: a first-hand knowledge of human behavior under extreme circumstances that couldn't be researched or fabricated.